when I learned that there was a profession that was about basically the science and the study of human behavior and change and transformation, I thought about the degree to which this was a missing link in my own community. And I remember in that high school class, I decided, I want to bring psychology back to my neighborhood. I want to bring the therapeutic field into the streets of Bed-Stuy and into the streets of those communities that are underserved and underprivileged. And then it was a straight and narrow path from then. I started to really think about what it meant to be an African-centered psychologist, which is a totally different brand of psychology, and trying to find ways of being able to address the trauma, as you mentioned, within the African community here in the United States. And so that has been my focus for the amount of years that I've been a psychologist.
What does it mean, Dr. Codrington, to be an African-centric or African-American-centric psychologist?
So African psychology is really concerned about what it means to be inside of the social and political history of African people, and the way in which our history shifts our perception of the world, our thoughts, our feelings, our ways of being, the way we interpret information, our development, our identity. We are not just melanated replicas of the dominant culture. So it's a very specific focus on African culture, African tradition, African values, and there's a social justice agenda inside of it, which is really about restoring people of African descent to their proper spiritual position in life, which is not as an oppressed people that are descendants of enslaved Africans, but people who are kings and queens and people who have the ability to control their own destiny and self-determination. So we don't focus on applying psychological theories by white psychologists to Black and brown people. We create our own theories.
I'm reminded of this quote by Tom Burrell where he says, Black people are not brown-skinned white people, which is very much, I think, part and parcel of what you just said. How does that show up in the mental health context? How does that show up in, obviously, understanding the racial differences and the social differences, but how does that show up in your practice when you are treating Black people who are coming to you who may not be able to name, I am dealing with this issue and the intersection of racial and gender depression, and they may not be able to have the language for it, but you have the ability to assess it. How does that show up for you in your practice?
Well, first of all, it shows up in doing a very holistic clinical interview. So a lot of times when you begin the therapeutic process, you have to understand and you have to assess the individual before you move forward with the therapeutic process. But in an African-centered perspective, we know that we are not just thoughts and feelings and behaviors, but there's spirit. And so injecting spirit into the conversation, and that doesn't mean religion, it doesn't mean, some hardcore ritual around, what you do day to day, but it also means understanding that there was a portion of you that was here before you physically got here. It means that a lot of the things that we experience are remnants of what our ancestors experienced, and that we carry sort of the genetic code, not just, our phenotype and our height, our weight, but also the degree to which our ancestors understood rhythm, the degree to which our ancestors were able to, be resilient. And so tapping into the wisdom of our ancestors and understanding, what did Big Mama teach you? What were the values that you understood as you were moving through the world, and how did you get separated from that? Looking at the degree to which people experience racial trauma. Those are conversations that you won't find in many traditional therapeutic conversations. There's no diagnostic code for racial trauma. And PTSD looks different when you're talking about oppression as opposed to rape right? And so you won't necessarily meet the criteria, but you have to be able to understand that there are certain realities, and racism, oppression, discrimination, all the isms that we face, I think as oppressed people, there needs to be permission to bring that into the therapeutic conversation. And so that to me is at the forefront, even with my children.